Well, the big thing that we have to realize is, and you see it in the press, you see it in the papers, is that Philadelphia schools are severely underfunded. My name is Anthony Hopkins, and I am the Communications Director of Public Citizens for Children and Youth. Public Citizens for Children and Youth, or PCCY as we call it, it is a nonprofit children's advocacy organization located here in Philadelphia. We do research and advocacy on behalf of our region's children. We focus on issues such as healthcare, education, hunger, poverty issues, and early education issues for children in the southeastern Pennsylvania area of Philadelphia County and Bucks County, Delaware County, Chester County, and Montgomery counties.
So I've been at PCCY for 3.5 years, and I am the Director of Education Policy. That basically means that I advocate for issues that benefit students in southeastern Pennsylvania.
My name is Kevin McCorry. I am the education reporter at WHYY News and newsworks.org.
So my name is David Lapp. I'm an attorney. I work for the Education Law Center. We are a nonprofit legal services organization that advocates for the rights of vulnerable student populations. So in other words, students with disabilities, students who are English language learners, students who are in foster care, students experiencing homelessness. And our emphasis is to try and ensure that those students are having access to a high quality education.
My name is Kristin Luebbert. I'm a teacher here at Bache-Martin Elementary, which is a K-8 school in the Fairmount and Francisville section of Philadelphia. And I'm a reading specialist. I also teach reading and social studies, but this year I'm functioning as a reading specialist, which means I work on different sizes of groups of kids, from whole class, sometimes with a smaller group.
So basically what happened was, in 2010 we had a new governor come into office, and he slashed $1 billion from basic education funding statewide. And the way that the education cut worked is it disproportionately hurt the poorest school districts in Pennsylvania. Particularly, it took $300 million away from Philadelphia's budget that year. That's about 15% of its total budget. And so we had 30 schools that have closed in the last 4 years. We've had hundreds of teachers, counselors, librarians, and school nurses all lose their jobs over the last 4 years. And then even this year, because not enough has been restored to Philadelphia school budget, that they had to make additional cuts. And so now we have schools that aren't being cleaned as regularly. We have school safety officers that are not available at every school as they used to be. So now our children are traveling to schools and going to schools that are less safe and less clean than they were even last year.
So a lot of our work is centered around making sure that kids have the funding they need to attend quality schools. And so last year we launched a big campaign to ensure that there were no more cuts at the state level. Over the last 3 years, students have experienced unprecedented cuts. I think we were underfunding public ed to the tune of $4.3 billion. And so what we know is we're nowhere near those numbers. We're still below the 2011 numbers. And so we're in a situation where we probably are talking about tens of millions of dollars, and that's what it costs to educate the largest school district, in the state.
That entire process of pressure to be a good school, combined with constraints that all our public schools are having with massive underfunding, Philadelphia is particularly under those pressures. And so we see these things of students being pushed out of schools, students being prevented from enrolling into schools to begin with, particularly acute here in Philadelphia. In contrast, we have a sort of very backward system in Pennsylvania, because the schools that have the least numbers of vulnerable at-risk students have the best resources to provide them with a public education. And the schools that have the most concentrations of those students have the least resources.
Another way it affects people is it affects the fact that there's never enough support. There's not enough support for the administrators. We don't have an assistant principal. We have one principal. So this is a person who's got to do everything administrative in the building. If he needs help with something administrative and needs a teacher to help him, then that means that teacher's not in the classroom.
Bottom line is, we don't have fair funding for our schools. Pennsylvania is one of only 3 states in America that doesn't have a well-funded and fair and equitable funding formula for education. And so what you have now happening here for Philadelphia teachers is they are paid less than teachers in the suburbs. They have to pay for supplies. they teach in much more challenging environments. Class sizes are bigger, students come from poor families, so they need additional support and education to help them learn, as opposed to children who come from well-off families in the suburbs. And so at the end of the day, how are you going to have a good teacher want to stay in a Philadelphia school if they can just go 10 miles east or 10 miles north and teach in a better school, get paid more, and not have to pay out of pocket so much for things? So that's the biggest challenge that our kids face.
In 2011, the economic recession hit and huge cuts came to public education. Those cuts were done in sort of an across-the-board proportional rate. So it wasn't done. In other words, there was no sort of effort to cut schools that had the ability to raise their own funds more, to cut those schools more. It was done across the board. So places like Philadelphia, which were highly dependent on state funding, were really hurt the worst by those cuts.
There's a lot of tough choices that have to be made. Sometimes those tough choices are closing schools. Sometimes those tough choices, for instance, recently imposing healthcare concessions on the teachers union, unilaterally breaking the teacher's contract.
Well, the kids really are affected by the underfunding of schools, because for my school, for this school, the primary thing that is affecting us right now is we only have a counselor 2.5 days a week. So we have 400 kids, some of whom need a lot of support in different ways. And the poor counselor's running between this school and another school that's not very geographically far away, but so she's not here when things happen. You may or may not know that there have been 2 student deaths in the last year that may or may not be attributed to the fact that the nurse wasn't there. I mean, we don't know because the nurse wasn't there, so we can't say, oh, if the nurse had been there, or, we'll never know that for sure, and that's tragic that we have to think that.
The problem is, when school started last year, they went from having a school nurse in every school, having school libraries open in all schools, to not having them at all. And what happens is, this year, they started at the same level as they were last year. Those school nurses weren't replaced. So, we have school counselors have not been replaced. If anything, we have lost cleaning supplies, we have lost school police officers. So we are actually worse off than we were last year. The problem is that folks now have to get used to this so-called new normal, where you are just dealing with the fact that you only have a school nurse a couple days a week. You really can't go to see your school counselor and get a recommendation letter for college, because you only have one counselor for an entire high school of 1,300 kids. People are just starting to now try to get used to that.
So there's 2 4th grade classes, and they have 1 set of social studies books between them. So they're like, okay, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, who wants the books on what day? That's kind of crazy. That wouldn't happen in Radnor or Lower Merion. And if you go in any other classroom in this building, you'll see the same thing, where the books on the bookshelves that are, reading books for the kids to take when they're doing other things, when they're done their classwork, or when they're to take home with them, those are all supplied for the most part by the teachers.
And I walked into a kindergarten classroom, and the teacher was giving a lesson on uppercase and lowercase letter B. And so the kids are, they have their black crayons, and I'm wondering why everyone's hands are so smudged. And I looked down, and all of the kids are writing on newsprint because the teacher didn't have actual white paper or lined paper to give to those students.
All our laptops are now, you can see what they are. They're, in laptop years, they're ancient. They're dinosaurs. The batteries are dying, and, so we just don't have the money to get the new materials that we need. They're not giving you transportation. They're not giving you a bus pass. They're not giving you a yellow school bus. So they didn't make this explicit. I can remember so many people in the office saying, oh, I need tokens, I need a trans pass. And we're saying, well, sorry, you're responsible to get your kid to school, whether it's a mile or, 10 miles. So that wasn't handled well. And that was, of course, because of the budget cuts. They don't have the money, to do that.
So we've had 30 public schools closed in the last number of years because simply their enrollments were getting smaller and smaller as charter schools were increasing their enrollment. We actually had a fairly strong commitment from the state that had recognized that we were not adequately funding our public education system. And so there was, during that era, regularly increased incremental increases in funding for public education around the state and in Philadelphia as well. Huge numbers of school districts in Pennsylvania are not being educated to what we call adequacy, what they call an adequacy target.
And in Philadelphia, we don't have those things. And it is really sad, and it's really going to just hurt future generations of children in this city. But here in Philadelphia, it's hard to graduate because teen pregnancy rates are high, dropout rates are fairly high. The graduation rate in Philadelphia is only around 60%. It's actually increased from around the 40% as it was maybe like 6-7 years ago. But it's only 60%. Whereas you go in the suburbs, it's like 98%, right? Like if you're a kid growing up and you go to a good high school, more likely than not you're going to graduate from high school. So that's the biggest challenges that kids here face, is because they have real life things to worry about. More often than not, they come from single families and they have a number of siblings, and so there's an idea that when you get to a certain age, you need to work to support the family. So as soon as you're 16 years old, you need to go out and what ends up happening is you have to determine what's more important: supporting my mother, my brother, my little sister, or going to school. And that's a tough choice. And you know what? Kids shouldn't have to make those choices. Kids should have these supports. These programs should be in place and well funded to help them get that education they need.
You have situations where there's not enough nurses, and the effects of that are clear and have been pretty clear. When you talk to nurses there who are going from school to school to school to school and only are in the same school once a week, it's hard to know kids. It's hard to know what's going on there. It's hard for then the principal's the one administering the shot or whatever it has to be. Of course, that affects kids.
You have what's called split grades, where you have one teacher teaching a group of third graders for one part of the class and then teaching fourth graders for another part of the class. It's almost going back to the old days of like a one classroom school. And I don't understand how you can possibly expect kids to get a quality education if they're only really getting half an education. But both candidates recently have said, and even Corbett signed the bill to create the Basic Education Funding Commission, which is a group of lawmakers and others that are all working together now to craft a new formula. So I feel, both candidates have made it pretty clear that they think we need to change the way we're funding schools. Children that are well fed are more likely to do better in the classroom because they're not dealing with hunger issues. And it's also very important because you got to keep in mind, Philadelphia is a very impoverished city, and so for a lot of kids, the only good meal that they'll get during the day is their school lunch. So this is very important to making sure that all kids are at least get that basic meal so that they can focus better in school. So at least then they have a chance to grow out of that impoverished system that they grew up in and lead a successful life. Well, one of the big things that happened last year is with the budget situation is that the Philadelphia School District had to lay off hundreds of music and art teachers and counselors and librarians. And some of that funding ended up getting restored, so they were able to bring back some music teachers. So now you have itinerant music teachers that are able to they travel to maybe 4 or 5 schools a week to do music lessons. But art is still very much lacking. And one of the things we do here at PCCY is we provide the Picasso Project, which is a mini arts grants program where we provide up to $5,000 for arts education programs in schools. And so we team up with local artists, come in, work with an artist at the school, and help the students to get both an arts education but also understand the whole situation that's going on with their school in terms of underfunding and things like that.
Philadelphia schools are asked to do a lot. We have a student population with very, very extensive needs. We have over 80% of our students are what we consider economically disadvantaged. But even more troubling than that is that we have the highest deep poverty rate.
So when the state takes away $1 billion, or in Philadelphia's case, $300 million in 1 year, that will significantly impact a poor school district. Whereas a wealthy school district, like Hatboro Horsham, for example, 82% of the funding for their school district comes from the local tax base. So when the state cuts funding for education, it won't necessarily impact a wealthy district like Hatboro Horsham the way it'll impact a poor district like Philadelphia. And so it creates this education based on where you live. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, chances are you're not going to get as good an education as if you just happen to live within the boundary lines of a wealthy school district. If a child would leave a public school and go to a charter school, the funding that the district would provide to that school would leave that school and go to the charter school, but the state would reimburse the school district so that the school wouldn't suffer as much. And so in 2011, that line item was cut. That's about $220 million a year that was cut. And so that's what leads to school closures, because kids leave the public school, the money goes with that child to a charter school, and the school is left. They still have the same costs. I mean, they still have to pay to keep the lights on and keep up with the maintenance and pay the teachers and all that, but now they have even less. And so really, what can you expect a child to think when they come to school and they just want to get a good education and they just see how bad it is around them? I mean, it just makes it that much harder for them to raise up out of that and be successful.
When we start to teach little kids at 5 years old that you're not good enough to have paper, we end up with a society of folks who really believe that no one cares about them, that they aren't important, and that they're not worth an investment. And then they go into a situation where every day they go through a metal detector and they're suspected of having a weapon. They go to a classroom that doesn't have supplies. They go to a school that doesn't feel safe. And then we wonder how we can have such a level of disengagement among young people.
There's usually a lawyer, a businessman in charge, or a politician, or all three. Bill Green's currently in charge, and he's a former city councilman and a lawyer. Oftentimes people who didn't go to public school, didn't send their kids to public school, don't really know the issues that a real public schools have around funding and around educating. But it really shouldn't be that in order to get reading books, you have to have somebody willing to write a grant to get them. That shouldn't be a thing in the United States.
The last decade was huge increases in the use of things like suspensions. And of course, studies have been shown that when students have suspensions, that's an indicator of future contacts with the criminal justice system.
When states determine how they're going to build a prison, they have to determine how many cells they need, how much seats they need. And the sole place where they look to determine is they look at current third grade reading levels, because it is well known that if children are not reading on grade level by the end of the third grade, they are more likely than not going to end up dropping out of school. And they're going to end kids, as I just said, as kids drop out of school, they're more likely to commit crimes and be incarcerated. So that's why if you're not going to invest in education, well then I guess you have to invest in prisons, because that's where your kid's going to end up. And of course what we need to do is we need to reverse that cycle so that we're investing in education so that more children graduate, they grow up healthy, they're successful.
But I think the larger issue is these statewide cuts have long-term ramifications. And if the state was doing its part, the teachers would have their contract.
When you go to school, there should at least be some opportunities there, some outlets for you to get away from all that. And not just for school hours, but after school too. If you want to play a sport, be focused on playing a sport, you should be able to do that so that so at least then you can get a break from some of the trying issues that you face back in your home neighborhood.
I guess I could say that it's clear when you don't have adequate resources in classrooms that has an effect on kids. There's no doubt about that. From the best schools in the city to the ones that are historically and continually underperforming.
We need to ensure, of course, that our schools are doing the right things, that they're using best practices, that they're hiring good teachers, and they're getting the training and professional development that they need to adequately serve these students. But we also know that that's not going to happen if we're continuing to starve our schools from having adequate funding.
That means 90% of our kids have extremely limited options in terms of the type of way they will live for the rest of their life, the situation that their kids will grow up in, what communities and what neighborhoods they'll be in. And so I think there's definitely enough data to show us that we're failing a lot of kids every single year.
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, so I gotta believe there's a light at the end of this tunnel. The solution here is to finally fix this problem, is for Pennsylvania to enact a fair funding formula. If we at least know, we have a predictable system that is based on the actual cost of providing quality education for children, then school districts everywhere, not just Philadelphia, but everywhere, can start to plan their school budgets. And so the biggest thing that the state needs to do in terms of fair funding is to restore the line item for charter school reimbursement. or at least come to some sort of system of capping enrollment for charter schools so it doesn't so negatively affect public schools.
We can actually develop a funding mechanism that focuses our funding much more directly to those schools with bigger need. And so that's one of the reasons why we filed a lawsuit a couple weeks ago to say to our General Assembly, this is your job. Our state constitution says that the General Assembly shall provide and maintain for a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth.
There is still really good work being done in the school system. There still is learning happening. There still are really hardworking students and teachers and administrators who are really doing a tough task in trying to get this population of kids to the next level.
The campaign for fair education funding that's made up of 50 organizations all working together to say, hey, this way we are funding schools in Pennsylvania is broken, and we need to start to work together, both sides, Democrats and Republicans, to put together a funding system so that we're not in a situation where a kid has to decide between work and going to school, whether or not a kid will have a nurse for them when they get sick. Just to make sure that schools have what they need so kids can get a quality education.
We need something more even across Pennsylvania because the rural districts are having the same kind of issues as the urban districts are. There's not a lot of tax base anymore. There's a lot of issues of poverty and they just can't fund the schools. So there's something that has to change in the fundamental way we fund schools in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so we can expect hundreds of Philadelphia citizens to come out, to use their voice, to bring their signs and their children, and to demand fair funding for Philly kids.
It shouldn't have to be charity. It should be something that we fund because it's part of the democratic nature of this country. It's something we've always believed in, and it's something that's important to the future of the country for everyone to be educated.